Back to your book, American Contempt for Liberty. Many view America's education as a failure, but in at least one important way it's been a success in dumbing down the nation so that we fall easy prey to charlatans, hustlers, and quacks.
I think that is absolutely right. I think that if you just look at, I haven't watched any of the debates, but if you look at some of the debates, and particularly those of on the Democratic side of the spectrum, you find that Americans don't really care about the character of the person and what they're calling for our nation. And I think that's because I think Americans have become dumbed down by the educational system. But there's another success in the educational system, and that is teachers and the people who run the educational system. They have far greater power and fewer accountability standards than they've ever had.
You've spent quite a bit of time writing about America's education system. What's happened to it, in your view?
Well, I think that there's several things that have happened that has not been that don't portend, for the good of the system. I think one has been the gross monopolization of education in our country. I believe the number is around 1950. There were 52,000 school districts in our country. Today, there are about 13,000 school districts. So there's been massive consolidation. I don't think that that's good for our system. And then I think that there are fewer accountability standards, both for students and both for educators. That is, we see that teachers and principals, they get pay raises and promotions whether the kids can read or write, and the kids get their diplomas whether they can read or write. And I think a startling condemnation for the school system is the fact that incoming freshmen in college, they're not ready for college. I think something close to 50% have to take remedial education either in reading, writing, or mathematics. And that's saying that the public schools, they're issuing fraudulent diplomas. That is, they're issuing a diploma that certifies that a kid can read and write at 12th grade level when in fact he cannot.
What do you teach at George Mason?
I teach the theory, economic theory, microeconomic theory. And in the fall, I teach our first PhD course with our incoming PhD students. I teach them the microeconomic theory. And in the spring, I teach an intermediate, which is an undergraduate course in economic theory.
What do you want your students to learn by the time they leave class?
Well, I think if I would love for my students to share my values, but I don't talk about my values in class. What I hope that they gain from my class is to learn how to think. That is, to learn how to engage in dispassionate analysis, and hopefully, if they get out in the world and they get into policy commissions, if they can engage in dispassionate analysis, they can come up with compassionate policies or compassionate ideas.
What kind of education did you have?
Well, I think I tell people, and it's not nice of me to say this, but I tell people that I am very happy that I received virtually all of my education before it became fashionable for white people to like black people. Now, what I mean by that is that when I earned a C in high school or in college, that was a real, honest-to-God C that I earned. And when I earned an A, that was a real, honest-to-God A that I earned. Those people did not care about the legacy of discrimination. They didn't care about my handicaps of being poor. They held me up to standards. And I think that that is very good. And I think that many students, both black and white, are not held up to high standards. For example, in my junior high school, one of our assignments was to write a 3-page essay. And I received my essay back from the teacher on 2 occasions, torn into 4 pieces with a little note on top of it, at least you could spell correctly, rewrite. And so, but if a teacher did that today, the teacher might be in a lot of trouble because she might be hurting the kids' feelings of self-esteem. Well, when I was going to school, teachers didn't give a damn about my self-esteem.
And this is from a column in 1997 that you wrote. For years, I've said that if the Ku Klux Klan wanted to sabotage black academic excellence, they couldn't find a tool more effective than the public school systems in most major cities. You were going to junior high at about the time of Brown versus Board of Education, correct?
High school, yes.
High school. Did that affect you at all? Did that change your classes?
No, it didn't. I went to a predominantly black school in North Philadelphia. And matter of fact, it was Benjamin Franklin High School. And at the time, Benjamin Franklin High School was the lowest rated school in the city. It was in North Philadelphia, predominantly black and low income area. But however, if you can imagine a time tunnel and you could pull Benjamin Franklin from 1954 up to today, then Benjamin Franklin would be probably one of the highest rated schools in the city of Philadelphia. And that's the reason why, is that standards, educational standards have plummeted so much. Now my statement about the Ku Klux Klan, I've often said that if you wanted to sabotage any chance of black academic excellence, you couldn't find a better way than the public school system in most cities. And what we do see, and that most Americans are unaware of, and particularly black Americans are unaware of, that is the average black high school graduate or the average black high school 12th grader, he has the reading, writing, math, and civics knowledge of the average white 7th or 8th grader. I mean, that is a devastating statistic. That is where a majority of blacks, they graduate from high school with a grossly fraudulent diploma. Now, the quality of education that white students get is nothing to write home about. That is because the standards are very, very low. That is, according to recent National Assessment of Educational Progress statistics for 2015, I think that's only 30 or 40% of white students score proficient in reading and math. But for blacks, it's 7% score proficient in math, and I think like 10% score proficient in reading.
Where do you see the why those disparities in results?
Well, there are probably a number of reasons. One has to do with the education system in general, but I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is that there are many inputs that go into education, and if some of the inputs aren't there, it doesn't make any difference on how much money you spend on education. Education would not occur. In other words, what I'm saying is that for a kid to do well in school, somebody must make sure that the kid is in bed by 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Somebody must get him up in the morning and get him to breakfast. Somebody must make sure he arrives at school on time. Somebody must make sure he does his homework. And somebody must make sure that he minds the teachers. If that is not done, I don't care how much money that you put into educational budget, education will not occur unless those things are done. And if you ask the question, well, can politicians do those things? Can the President of the United States make sure a kid is in bed on time? Can a mayor or can a congressman or a senator? No. That is, you need a parent. And by the way, I think you need two parents.
When did, in your view, when did this start to switch? When did these standards become dualities, and when did the change in education begin, and why?
Well, I think if I were just to try to find a time, I think during the 60s and 70s, standards began to change. Matter of fact, I remember my mother used to complain about the preachings of Dr. Spock, saying that you shouldn't spank your children. Well, regardless of what Dr. Spock advised, I got spanked, And so I think what we started to do, we started to in terms of education, we started to move away from things that worked very well to things that sounded good. That is, we went from things that worked well to doing things that sound good, and things that sounded good didn't. They weren't very productive. Matter of fact, one example of this is that I live in a high-income neighborhood in the state of Pennsylvania. But and my wife had been trying to get me to move my daughter out of this fairly good public high school, and I was resisting it because the tuition at the private school was like $14,000 a year. This is back in the '80s, and what convinced me to move her to the private school was a parent-teacher meeting that I had with her teachers. And her math teacher, with all of her teachers, 6 teachers in the room, and along with me, and the math teacher said, well, your daughter has not been turning in her assignments in time. It's been sloppy work, has not been paying attention. I said, well, why didn't you flunk her? We didn't know anything about it. And he said, well, we don't like to flunk the kids. We want the kids to feel good about themselves. And I told him, I said, I feel good about myself every time I solve a set of quadratic equations. And so I went home that evening. I told my wife, let's start looking for a private school.
And did the standards change? Did the teaching
yes.
change?
Matter of fact, one of the things at the private school, we were interviewing several private schools, and the school that we ultimately decided to send my daughter to, the headmistress of the school said, we don't hire education majors. That is, if you teach a course in English, you have to have your degree in English. If you teach a course in math, you have to have your degree in math. And also, if my daughter was slack on some of her jobs, on some of her work, we knew within the next 2 days because they sent an interim report home. And if she did something very well, we would know that as well.